Welcome back, motorized bike enthusiasts. Sit back and relax as we deal with more issues than I can count in today's video. We will be installing a rack and panniers on the Daily Driver, unboxing and installing a new motor on the Path Dragon, cleaning and porting the Big Bore iron sleeve cylinder for that new motor, and fixing a random neighborhood's kid bike that got pretty messed up in a crash. Installing a rack and pannier set for one of my bikes has been on the to-do list for quite some time. I've held off for a few reasons, one being price. They're not cheap. Two is practicality. I simply haven't been able to justify the need to have them. And three, aluminum parts plus small engine vibration can equal I had a bad day in the future. They can break suddenly and without warning, and if they get between your tire and the frame, that's pretty much the same situation as you would have with the stock aluminum fenders. My experience with this setup so far is pretty limited, as I've only been riding it for about a week to and from work and short shopping trips. But I'll weigh some of the pros and cons that I've noticed right out the gate, as well as repeat some of the information from other YouTube members and members in the Discord server. The list of pros that I've noticed so far is pretty short. However, this might change in the future as we have more experience with this build, so stay tuned to the channel if you're interested to see how well this setup works out. Obviously, you have more cargo room. This is self-explanatory, and we don't need to go over why that's a good thing, especially if you take your bike shopping or on longer trips. And if you don't need to carry a crazy amount of cargo, then you can simply ditch the backpack altogether and have a much more comfortable ride. Less back pain, less fatigue, more comfort. This next one's kind of a niche for my bike because I use a suspension seat post, but if you plan on getting one or you already have one, you'll be happy to get the backpack off of your back because it can do its job better. When I'm loaded down going to work with food, tools, spare parts, and other work-related items, that backpack's pretty heavy, and the suspension seat post really can't do its job to peak efficiency. But when I take it off and I ride, it's very comfortable. And the last one I can really think of is kind of a customization, if you're going for looks. In my situation on this particular bike, I think that the bag setup I got for this rack, or the panniers, is really nice looking. The bike just looks pretty sweet. So, it's kind of a customization thing, and you have it if you need it. You can take it off if you don't want it. And you could always ditch the panniers altogether if they just don't work out, or have them around when you need them, and keep the rack on the bike because that's always convenient, as you can strap anything you want onto the top of it, considering the limitations of the rack. On that note, I'd like to point out something that one of my viewers left in the comments of one of my videos about racks and panniers, is you can simply ditch the pannier altogether and just go with the rack and a backpack. You can strap your backpack to the rack, and if there was ever an issue with the rack, then you could put it on your back. It seems the best of both worlds in my opinion, and is a great idea that I'll probably utilize every once in a while. Our list of cons is slightly subjective, and it also weighs against alternative options, which we'll get into in a moment, but now that you have all this cargo room on the bike, you might find yourself feeling compelled to fill it up with unnecessary stuff. Try to avoid that. The bike's heavy as is with the motor, and then you added a rack and pannier with all this cargo, and you probably have a cheap China bike like mine. If you don't, then that's great, but if you do, you're asking for trouble if you weigh this thing down. Just because the weight's not on your back doesn't mean it magically disappeared. It's still on the bike. Now it's all over the rear axle, instead of being split between the two. For safety, you really need to make sure it's secured on a motorized bike. You need to make sure those straps aren't flapping around to get sucked into the chain or the spokes, and you need to make sure the bag is not rubbing, especially on the chain. You also have to consider what you're going to do if you have multiple bikes. Say you just want to ride one of the other bikes someday, and you have all your stuff in the pannier. Now you got to swap it out to a backpack, which isn't a big deal, I know, but it is an inconvenience. Now you need to consider your riding style, which a lot of viewers brought up in our previous short video about the rack and pannier. How do you ride your bike? Do you ride over smooth terrain? Great. Do you have to negotiate curves? Not so great. Trying to get that rear tire up when you have it weighed down, not the best thing to do in the world, and if you just slam it into the curb, well then say goodbye to your rear rim. Also keep in mind storage. If you like to bring your bike inside or you have to go upstairs, it's something to keep in mind. Now obviously you can just take the pannier off the rack, but in some situations that might be slightly inconvenienced, as it does take, I'd say a good 15 to 20 seconds to unclip everything, which might not be much, but if you do it every day, it can add up. Depending on how often you take your bike shopping and or on long trips, you might consider the alternative options, the main one being a bike trailer. More specifically, a single wheel bike trailer which is stabilized by the bike, and not a dual wheel bike trailer, which I've personally used and found that they tip over quite easily when they don't have weight in them. And even when they do have weight in them, they still occasionally tip over if you hit a bump or you just take a turn too fast, which is really easy to do on a motorized bike. Bike trailers are great for two reasons. One, you almost always have more cargo space, and two, they take all the weight off of the frame of the bike and put it on their own axle and wheel set. It's much easier for a bike to pull weight than it is for a bike to carry weight. But you're weighing options here. A pannier set with a rack is much more maneuverable than a bike trailer. Your riding style and where you ride is going to dictate which one's a better option. Also storage. It's easier to store a pannier and the bike than it is to detach a trailer and put it away. For installation, it's simple and straightforward. If you've already put a motor on the bike, this is going to be child's play. I would say 2 hours tops if you're easily distracted like me, or 1 hour for most normal people. The rack just clamps onto the frame and the seat post. There's nothing to say about it. There were a few tedious moments where I'd accidentally put a bar on in the wrong orientation and have to redo a few things to get it right, but that's it. The quality of the rack actually looks pretty good, and I think it's going to last, but we'll see how it goes. For the panniers, they just clip onto the rack and are secured on the undercarriage with a clip and strap. Nothing notable there. However, I accidentally chose a bad combination of pannier and rack. Now the rack's fine, and so are the panniers, but the panniers are a bit too big for this rack as the side cage doesn't go down far enough to fully support the panniers, leaving them bouncing off of the spokes, which is obviously a very bad thing. We temporarily solved this issue with some bungees between the cage and the frame of the bike, and that's been working great so far, but I'll try to find a more permanent solution down the road. A short detour before we move on to the motor swap with the Path Dragon and porting the big bore cylinder is we had a bit of an accident here in the neighborhood this week, and I'm adding this short section to the video for two important reasons. A young girl on her brand new bike with, lo and behold, no working brakes because they weren't adjusted properly at the store, went down a very steep hill and had no way to stop. It's the steepest hill we have in town. I won't even touch it with my bikes, and thank God there was no cross traffic, but she did go full speed into a ditch and she got pretty messed up. So did her bike. There's not much I can do to heal her, but we can make the best out of a bad situation by fixing up her bike, making it look close to new, and making it safe. When I was young, my bikes would have issues. My neighbors would always help. They didn't think twice. If it wasn't for them, I probably wouldn't be riding bikes today, and you wouldn't have any of this content. So we're going to pay it forward, which is what you should do if you can, but only if you have the knowledge to fix it up right. Don't work on something if you don't know what you're doing, but if you can, help people out. And second, if you're a parent and you're going to buy your kid a bike, the first thing you should do is check the brakes. There are other things on the bikes you should check to make them safe as well, but the brakes, because stopping is most important. And remember, this isn't something that you can just check once when it's new and forget about it. Kids can wear out brakes really quick. So if they ride their bikes a lot, check it yourself or show them how to do it. Upon initial inspection, I just took one glance and I knew right away that the rear brakes were never touching the rim on this bike. And the front brake lever was broken in the crash, so I couldn't tell what the engagement was for sure, but because the cable was still attached to the inner portion of the lever, and seeing how much space was between the caliper and the rim, I could tell that these pads barely touched the rim. They still had most of their meat on them, and very little of the paint was worn off of the rim. And the feeling I get knowing that she was squeezing her brake levers as hard as she could and not slowing down is just terrifying. We started by straightening and tightening the stem, lifting and tightening the handlebars, checking and truing the wheels, checking the bearings for excessive wobble, tightening the wheels and the pegs after a good clean, removing jagged broken chain guards, and trimming the seat as well as patching it best we can, Gorilla Tape. I replaced the reflectors and the front brake lever. We adjusted the brakes, front and rear, cleaned the bike, and oiled the chain. Good as new. Almost. Recently, we've been testing out the new YouTube Shorts feature. It's a great way to put out quick little videos when I need to do small tweaks to bikes. And if you caught one we did a few weeks ago, you'll note that we got a big bore cylinder, 49 millimeters, with an iron sleeve from CDH. Unfortunately, if you saw that video, you know that the one we got has major casting flakes on every single port, and not a single one of the iron sleeve ports match the cylinder. So we need to do some work to this, but we'll get into that in a moment. First, we need a motor to put it on. Now at the moment, the Path Dragon has a Zeda 4040 on it, but it's old, beat up, it's been rebuilt once, and it's making a terrible noise that I can't figure out, so we're just going to swap out motors. I'll end up using that Zeda as a bench platform for porting future cylinders. The engine kit we purchased for this motor swap was the same one listed in the May update video, link in the description. For about $120 from Amazon, it checks off all the boxes that I look for in a cheap motor. 8mm mounting studs, the 40mm lower mount, 40mm stroke, 40mm intake, upgraded case hardware, upgraded carburetor. It's essentially a Zeda 4040. Unfortunately, we did not win what I like to call the Amazon lottery, such as my landlord did when he purchased this exact listing, and some of the comments on that video also won the lottery. The upgraded kit, which you might sometimes receive for the same price, has a G4 cylinder and the NT speed carburetor, as well as a 4-bolt chain tensioner. So we're not losing, they didn't scam us or nothing, we got exactly what we were expecting, and it's a good motor in my opinion. We was just hoping for a repeat of the first purchase. That, however, is not to say that this was a trouble-free motor. It had a major clutch issue, which we'll eventually figure out later in the video. Let's move on to the cylinder. This cylinder is an absolute mess. The casting flakes are like nothing I've ever seen. They were essentially pressed in place when they inserted the iron sleeve. You couldn't just rub them off with your finger or file them down with a bit of sandpaper. These had to literally be gouged out with picks. I got it done, but it was tedious and took forever. But the cylinder has another major issue, and that's the iron sleeve. The ports on the sleeve do not match the cylinder, which means there's lips on the intake, exhaust, and transfer. And not just a few millimeters. I'm talking like 5, 6, 7 millimeters. And this is bad because from what I understand, the transfers have a very specific roof angle which helps guide air into the cylinder for peak efficiency and power. So they'll push the exhaust gas out, keeping the fresh mix at the back of the cylinder for as long as they can while the exhaust port's still open. Unfortunately, that goes right out the window because the transfer air is just going to hit a wall, turn into turbulence, and get jumbled into the cylinder. I had two options. I could try and grind the iron sleeve to match the stock port work on the cylinder, or first I could reach out to two-stroke ports on YouTube, have him run some numbers, and try and do minimal port work first to see what kind of performance we get before turning this glorified paperweight into an overpriced doorstop. So we decided to go with the latter. Thankfully, two-stroke ports showed us how to properly read a degree wheel, and he ran some numbers for us. Turns out we could just port the exhaust by lifting it a little bit and making it wider. We'll run this first to see what kind of performance we get, and if it still runs like crap, then I'll try and match the transfers and the intake. But I suspect that if it doesn't run good with this port work, it's never going to run good. Time for the motor swap. With the Zeda off the Path Dragon and the new motor in its place with the cleaned and ported cylinder, I was anxious to get this bike started, but I couldn't because the clutch would slip. It was an issue I'd never had before. I went over all my standard clutch diagnosing procedures, and they didn't help me at all. I even went as far as to change out the nice upgraded clutch pads that this kit came with for some cheaper ones, and that didn't help either. So I just ended up botching and wasting a good pair of clutch pads. Turns out that a pin inside the clutch assembly became dislodged and was not applying enough force to the clutch pads to start the motor. This is an issue which I'll go over in a future video as I've cataloged this entire process, as well as address a few other issues that I've learned can happen since then, but that'll be a future video. For now, let's just deal with it. So we reseated this pin inside the clutch assembly and made sure it wouldn't come back out, then took it out for its first test ride. Must be a joke. After dealing with that headache of a clutch issue for a number of hours, it was a big relief to feel this motor kick right into action. After a few adjustments, we got it to idle just fine, and she feels like it's going to be a good pull. I can't tell you anything about performance right now because, well, that was the first ride, and we need to break this motor in properly. I'm not making the same mistake I did with my first iron sleeve. We're going to be pretty gentle on this motor for the first 2 tanks before we really open it up and see what it can do. It's also going to get some upgrades. We're going to tune it once it starts to get, at least a half, maybe full tank into the break-in, and then we're going to add a pipe, along with a new tank and a few other upgrades to hopefully breathe some life back into this old trail bike, the Path Dragon. I hope you enjoyed today's adventures with random bike stuff, guys, and until next time, ride safe.